My name is Carl Howard. I'm co-chair of the New York State Bar Association's Environmental and Energy Law Section's Global Climate Change Committee, and I'm an enforcement attorney at the US EPA Region 2 in New York City. I write a climate change blog for the Bar Association, and if you'd like to be on my distribution list, send me an email with your email address. My email address is in the chat box. So I'm communicating with you through the chat box, but again, you should communicate to me with your questions in the Q&A box. In my most recent climate change blog, I wrote about the melting ice shelves in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, and the likelihood that sea level rise will occur faster, sooner, and with more devastating impacts than previously predicted by the IPCC and others. Sea level rise threatens millions of people globally who live near the coasts, and it threatens trillions of dollars in real estate and infrastructure, the destruction of which threatens the global economy. Climate change also threatens the stability of the jet stream and the oceanic currents, which threatens the stability of global climate, which allowed agriculture and human civilization to develop. And all of this will force millions of people to migrate, which threatens global political stability. It is not hyperbole to say that these things are happening now and that they pose a real and present danger to the future of human civilization as we know it. Sea level has been fairly stable for 6,000 years, which is most of human civilization, but it's risen 8 inches in the last century, and the rate is tripling now. Experts predict that regardless of mitigation efforts, sea level rise will be approximately 1 foot by 2050. Thereafter, fairly high probabilities indicate up to 5 to 10 feet by the end of the century, which is considerably more than up to 3 feet in a high greenhouse gas emission scenario forecast by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2022. The physical impacts of climate change are so large and so frequent and so destructive that I struggle to summarize them in my blog and keep them from flooding my blog. I also want to convey the great strides that we are making in generating renewable energy. Unfortunately, we are also continuing to pour greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which threaten all state and federal goals intended to honor the Paris Accord of keeping global warming at 2 degrees Celsius and ideally at 1.5. Regardless of whether those remain achievable goals, we have no choice but to continue to try. The good news is that globally, there is overwhelming consensus that climate change is real and adaptation and mitigation measures must move forward as soon as possible. The US is the exception, where one of 2 major political parties has decided to oppose addressing climate change. Professor Gerard will note in his talk, Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise 2025, should there be a change of party leadership then? To answer the first question that always arises, yes, there is much you can do. Welcome to the empowerment part of our program. Here are the big 3. The first is vote. Regardless of office, the candidate should have a position on climate change, and you are free to vote accordingly. And by vote, I mean go all in. Send money to organizations working for your candidate of choice, and have many candidates of choice at the national, state, legislative, and local levels. Send them money. Send money to organizations working for them because, for better or for worse, our system is greased by money. Second, reduce your carbon footprint. There are many important ways to do this. Have solar panels on your homes and offices and everywhere you go. Push your kids' school to install solar panels, your church, your synagogue. I've got my mom urging her retirement community to install them. The same goes for heat pumps and lighting. Ensure that you have the latest, most efficient lighting, heating, cooling systems, and insulation everywhere that you can have an influence. Drive an EV, or at least a hybrid. Third, your diet is important. Billions of cows releasing methane adds up. Eat low on the food chain. The agriculture sector's contribution to climate change is significant, approximately 10% of total US greenhouse gas emissions, not including emissions from on-site fossil energy use. Support green growers and responsible farmers. And buy shade-grown coffee because it's better for the birds, insects, and biodiversity. Do the big three and divest, ensure that you're not supporting any entity that supports the fossil fuel industry, and you will make a difference. Chatham House's report for the UK government 2023, a year in review, stated, quote, cascading climate impacts can be expected to cause higher mortality rates, drive political instability, and greater national insecurity, and fuel regional and international conflict. The cascading risks identified of greatest concern were the interconnections between shifting weather patterns, resulting in changes to ecosystems and the rise of pests and diseases. Combined with heat waves and drought, these impacts will likely drive unprecedented crop failure, food insecurity, and migration. In turn, all will likely result in increased infectious diseases and a negative feedback loop compounding each impact, end quote. The stakes could not be higher. The Biden administration is making billions of dollars available to redirect this immense ship of state. In 2022, generation from renewable sources, primarily wind, hydro, and solar in that order, surpassed coal-fired generation in the electric power sector for the first time, and that trend continued in 2023. Here on the East Coast, wind power will be an increasingly big player. Vineyard Wind, located off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, is currently generating 5 megawatts of power from a single wind turbine. But 61 more turbines with 800 megawatts of capacity, enough to power 400,000 homes, will follow. Another large project off the coast of New York, South Fork Wind, began producing power in December of 2023. Once completed, South Fork will be capable of producing 132 megawatts of electricity, energy to power more than 70,000 homes. New Jersey's Board of Public Utilities awarded 2 contracts for electricity from offshore wind farms in January 2024 as part of Governor Murphy's goal of getting 11,000 megawatts of power, enough to power more than 5 million homes from offshore wind by 2040. Big things are happening, both at home and abroad. I've glommed onto the latest coined term, apocalyptic optimism, to describe a belief that humans can still avoid the worst ravages of climate change. We also need a clear understanding of what we're up against. Our speakers will give you more insights into various aspects of this enormous topic of climate change. Mark William Wysocki has his screen up, so I will introduce Professor Wysocki. His lifelong interest in astronomy and physics led him to the University of Arizona in Tucson and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee graduate program in meteorology. For the past 40 years, he has taught astronomy and meteorology courses. He currently serves as New York State climatologist. He teaches courses on air pollution, meteorology, advanced forecast, introduction to Fortran, and fluid dynamics for the earth sciences, which emphasizes the practical application of meteorological concepts. He is the recipient of numerous awards for excellence in teaching and scholarship. His research interests include air pollution forecasting, weather analysis, and planetary atmospheres. Professor Wysocki, a senior lecturer emeritus, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Cornell University, will give us a scientific view of extreme weather. Take it away.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Carl, for inviting me. So I thought what I would do is talk to you about some of the big issues that we have seen in the last few years, not only here in the Northeast, in New York in particular, but also what's been occurring across the world. Before I start, I do like to thank 2 people, Jessica and Samantha, who work for the Northeast Regional Climate Center here. And they have helped me supply some of this graphics and data that you will see. So let's start off. Everybody talks about extreme weather. So what do we mean by that? As usual, it's kind of hard to define extreme weather events. People say it's easy to recognize, but difficult to define. Why? Because how do you classify it? For instance, how do you classify heat wave? In the Netherlands, it's 5 consecutive days of 77 degrees Fahrenheit. But yet, if you go to Australia, it's 3 consecutive days of 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So people have different definitions for different types of extreme weather. Makes it a little difficult for us to try and unify classification, especially around the world, as to the number of events that are occurring and so forth. So what we do then is we turn our attention to math. And there's an acceptable definition. And that definition is when we take a look at the distribution climatologically of a certain event in your region. And we define the extreme as an extreme event based upon roughly 5% greater or less than the average that you would have in that distribution. So just briefly, everybody sees these kind of curves. Everybody knows about this. You collect data, you get an average, you get a distribution. What I'm talking about here is what's on the extreme right and left. Those would be considered to be the extreme events, extreme weather. And not every piece of event fits this. For instance, I'm showing you a nice distribution. It has positive and negative numbers. For precipitation, you only get half the curve. So you're only looking at precipitation as a positive number. It can't get less than 0. So here's some of the distributions using temperature. And you can see from the 50s and 60s all the way up to the 2000s, the different colors sit there. You can see how this distribution is shifting to the right, where we're starting to see now warmer temperatures more consistently. And therefore, what might have been an extreme temperature in the 50s may come now to fall into the normal category in the 2000s. And now we get a new extreme, which was very extreme in the 50s or didn't even occur. The bottom graph over there shows you the distribution of how many record-setting highs and lows we have seen by the decades. I will draw your attention to the 60s. We moved our weather stations from downtown areas where the federal buildings were out to the airports. So what you're actually seeing is a drop in temperature, or you're seeing what we meant by urban heat island effect. And that has recovered now. And you can start to see that we're seeing more extreme high temperatures than we're seeing extreme low temperatures. In other words, this shift in the temperature profile distribution is going to the right. You may have heard a term called the new normal. And that's pretty much what we're talking about. We're shifting the normal, the average temperature from the 50s to what it is now in the 2000s. And we're starting to bring in these much hotter temperatures that are starting to show up around the globe. We can also take our data and look at it as trend lines, where you'll see quite a few of these for today, where we have something that's increasing over time or decreasing over time. A lot of these types of trend lines are used for specific events that I will now start to talk about. So the first one I want to talk to you about is something called a wildfire. So we have to have a definition of this so that we can identify what is a wildfire. One, it has to be unplanned. It's unwanted fire burning, okay, in a natural area. Forest fires, bush fires, and grass fires all get collected into a wildfire. It really depends upon what kind of vegetation is being burned, whether it's a ponderosa pine or whether it's a grassland in Texas that is on fire. They are wildfires, but then we can specify more by what the vegetation is actually happening. So forest fires, what have they done? They've changed quite a bit. What we're seeing is that the forests that we see in the open areas, the fires have become more concentrated, closed in on certain regions of the forest. The vegetation, such as the junipers and so forth, these are the kind of bush-like materials. They've actually encroached on many grasslands. There's a big problem in Nebraska and Kansas, by the way, where a lot of the open range land is being taken over by these junipers that are growing very rapidly, which is an agricultural problem. We also note that the glaciers are in retreat, and we also know that the climate is changing in such a way. We're also changing the use of our land. both in terms of agriculture, mining, as well as urbanization. Plus, we have the spread of invasive species. So I have up over here a little beetle about the size of your thumbnail. It's called the pole pine beetle, and it used to be confined to Mexico. But in the last 10 years, because of the warm winters out west, this beetle has managed to migrate all the way up into Canada. And what does it do? It goes after one particular type of tree, the pole pine tree, which is called that because that's where you get your telephone poles from. You can see on the right the kind of devastation this beetle does. It can destroy that kind of specific tree. You can see all the other green junipers on the other side. So it's species specific. That's a lot of dead wood sitting there. As that dries up and now you get a lightning strike, that starts to go up and burns much hotter. As it burns much hotter, that's a more complete burn, which means it releases more chemicals into the atmosphere that can be carried from that location by the transporting winds. What we've noticed from 1971 and so forth is that we see a 172% increase in burned areas, and that is actually not a steady increase. It's actually gone up since 1996, 320%. So we don't have a linear curve. We're having an exponential increase that we're starting to see these changes that are occurring, such as this trend in terms of the acreage burned from 1980 up to around 2022 in this particular case. You can see that this trend is an upward trend. Also, if you take a look between the 80s and the 2000, there's like a trend. And then also there's a steep increase in the trend that occurs in the early 2000s. So these trend lines become important to show us how things are changing, how rapidly they are also changing. Take you back to last year, the news was Canada. Canada had 16 times more fires than they usually would have. And in fact, it was the worst year ever on record for Canada. You can see that these are burning in very remote areas. It's very difficult to put the fires out, get people there. So these things are burning uncontrolled, being whipped up by the winds. The smoke is then transmitted into the atmosphere and will be carried away by the winds. As this satellite image shows, in terms of the very large smoke that you see out in Ontario, that actually came from the fires in Manitoba. And then you can see the small forest fires in Quebec. And some of those smoke plumes actually managed to make it here into New York State. This is the map of all the forest fires last year that were going on in Canada. Gives you some idea of how big they were and so forth and where they're located. Very remote areas, hard to get to, hard to put out. They are just basically going to burn continuously. Transport winds last year were set up in such a way that the jet stream would come up through British Columbia, go through central Canada and down into the Great Lakes and into the Northeast, thereby transporting the smoke from these fires, even though not here in the Northeast, but from Canada. So this is a map showing what was like in July across the United States. The gray areas are health quality alerts. These are for people with respiratory diseases and so forth. The blue line is the important line. That's the transport winds, the jet stream. And during the summer, that line kind of migrated east and west. It bounced back and forth. So when it went westward, then you had Montana, Colorado. It moves a little bit eastward. You get the Great Lakes, and further east, you get into Pennsylvania, New York, and all the way down to Washington, D.C. Of note, we also had an excessive heat wave occurring down in the Southwest, and therefore we were setting record temperatures sitting down there, not only in terms of the height of the temperature, that is the magnitude, but also the duration. A lot of new record low highs were set, where overnight lows were like 85 or 90 degrees. That is not good. This is the map showing the air quality index that gets into the purple. I'll show you what that means shortly here. It looks like we can do things by county. Unfortunately, we don't have enough data out there, i.e. instruments. That's something the EPA is trying to work on, as well as local states, to understand that we need to get better monitoring of the air quality so that we can help the National Weather Service put out these kinds of alerts. So this is the color scheme that is used and adopted. It's based on the Navy. Green is good. Maroon is not too good. So purple is very unhealthy, which means that everybody, no matter what your age is or your health currently, you are at some kind of risk if you're outside breathing the air in. What you see is New York City in the upper left going to Washington, D.C. Down lower left is Chicago. And you can see then what it was like in Toronto. You can see that this is the pollution, the smoke. These are the small particles. They're about a size of 2.5 microns. What is that? Oh, take your hair, cut it into 1,000 pieces. That's 1,000th of a hair diameter. That goes right through your nose, your mouth, in deep into your lungs, and that's where the damage is done. Not initially, but on a long-term basis, you're going to start to see 8 to 12 years from now, a huge number of people with asthma and bronchitis from this one event. This is what New York State did, and specifically New York City. Before the smoke wave came in June, the number of people that came into hospital visits by age based for asthma, and you can see after, you can see there was quite a big jump in that 6th to the 8th June. So it does affect you immediately in terms of coughing, wheezing, burning, and so forth. It can go away, but some damage can be done that lingers on, like I said, 8 to 12 years down the road. We also have New York City pretty well instrumented up with sensors and so forth, so we can break it down also by the boroughs in terms of the emissions and so forth. However, they also did this nationwide, the Health and Human Services Department, and this kind of looks a little confusing, but it's the big blues that you see that come up. That's the smoke exposure. Those are the dates when they had the real big exposures. And we have the different age groups that you see up over there for all ages, and then 5 to 17, 8 to 16. The bottom one is just trying to show you those people that went into the major alerts where you had a very large exceeding concentration of these small, fine particles. And you can kind of see they corresponded pretty close to maybe a little 1 or 2 days out of phase with the big smoke events. So things that are happening out west, away from us, get transported to various areas, and you still can have a huge impact. The EPA, the Forest Service, they have actually started tracking since '83 these big fires and so forth, acreage burn. It fluctuates up and down in all of this. And what we're starting to see is that you also have emissions not only of particles, but also of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide that can go into the air. It looks like we might be on somewhat of a downward trend. You might look at this, but just remember, we've burned a lot of forest already. So it's really trying to add new, as this is showing, the last 20 years up to about 2021, all the red dots show where the forest fires have really been occurring. And if you really take a look at this, you're seeing this occurring at high latitudes, up around the what we call boreal areas, central Canada, up to maybe close to the Arctic Circle. You see it both for North America, and you can see it also out in Europe, Russia, China, and so forth. So the real impact that we're starting to see in the northern hemisphere is the high latitudes. In the southern hemisphere, we're seeing that in the Amazon, and we're seeing that down along Australia. Not quite symmetrical across the equator in that particular case. So here we go again with the number of fires that we see. The boreal regions, as I said, would be Canada, Hudson Bay, up to the Arctic, that kind of region. We're seeing a big increase in fires in that location. And that's because of the climate changing. The heating is occurring in those regions. This is the Australia down in Australia. Excuse me. You can see that smoke going all the way over to the Pacific Ocean. And it's pretty dense smoke. And what that smoke is going to do, even though it's above the surface, it's actually going to reflect more of the sunlight back out into space. So a recent study has shown that these fires actually help the La Nina, which is the cooling of the ocean, to be extended for a longer period of time. Excuse me. Now, once that happens, La Nina controls a lot of the weather downstream, the United States, all the way out to the Mediterranean. So that can lead to a change in the weather patterns where you can actually get cold outbreaks, like you probably saw in Texas. So even though the planet is warming, you can now be susceptible to these extreme weather events where it's not only extreme hot, but now you can get extreme cold, especially in areas where you normally don't get them. This again shows worldwide what happened in Europe in 2003. And again, you can kind of see that they were also having an extreme problem, both in terms of the fires, but also in terms of the health. You might have remembered the one in Greece where everybody had to run from the resort area into the Mediterranean and so forth. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is sea level rise. This is a big problem, especially for the Northeast or coastal regions. We've gone up 8 to 9 inches since 1880. This is due to glacier melt, the ice sheets, Greenland, Antarctic. Also, when you warm water, it expands. All of that shows that we have seen an upward trend in this kind of sea level rise. Now, everybody's sitting there going like, okay, fine, the sea level's going up. Who really cares about all this? Well, here's Swell Point, Virginia. And you can see how far up the sea level there along the coast is actually going up. Coastal areas are the ones that are going to suffer the most. What we're seeing also here is a big decrease in the glaciers. Glaciers are going down, they're melting more. That water is going into the ocean. Oceans are going up. What do we find? Everybody's moving to the coast. We already find about 40% of our population within about 60 miles of the coast. Look at that. If you start raising the sea level now, these people are going to be subjected to a great deal of flooding. Flooding that's going to come from very typical kinds of storms, whether they be thunderstorms or whether they be hurricanes. That's going to cause water flooding to move further inland, and that's going to start impacting infrastructure, health issues, things like this. So we have a combination going on. The sea level is going up because we're warming, and we're moving people closer to the shoreline in all of this. Example, New York City. Here's a map of the density per square mile. Yeah, it looks pretty dense around the boroughs and so forth, New York City, Newark, and so forth. But watch out. This is the population of New York during the daytime. When people leave the city to go to the suburbs and so forth, the population decreases. What's going to happen in a flooding event now, or if you have some kind of hurricane that comes up and you get a storm surge, and now you've got all these people at work during the weekend, during the weekday, how are you going to get them out of there fast enough? And where are you going to put them? That's going to be another big problem we saw with Katrina and so forth. Where do you displace people? Do you put them in Binghamton? Do you put them in Albany? Do you put them in Buffalo? What's the extent that storm is going to have? So again, we see this sea level rise all along the East Coast here, Philadelphia and Delaware. The upward trend is pretty straightforward. And therefore, any ordinary type of hurricane, Category 1 comes in. In the 1970s, not much damage. Now, you're going to have a much larger amount of damage and problems. Here are the projected sea level rises and the various flood areas put together by FEMA. Purple is current. The yellow is going to be by the end of 2030, and the orange will be by the end of 2050. So you start putting a population map on top of that. And what are you going to do with people now that are well entrenched? They have their homes built. What are you going to do? Move them? And then you can start talking about the wall that they want to put around New York, this area, to prevent the sea level from happening. That's going to be fairly expensive. Storm surge. Do you hear about it? What does it really mean? Well, it can be from a hurricane. It can be from a very strong thunderstorm. What it is that the winds over the ocean are pushing the ocean on towards the shore. So it actually raises the sea level a little bit along the shore, and then it can push it further inland. And we're starting to see with a higher sea level rise, you can start pushing this water further inland in this case. So here we go. This is something I want you to watch. Everybody thinks a storm surge is one big wave that comes on. It is a very slow moving, gradual increase that you're going to see here. So just watch very carefully this sign and that building, and then watch what happens on the street as the storm surge is starting to move. This is down in Florida or Tampa Bay. This is the onset of a storm surge. And now you start to see as the ocean is just being pushed onto the shore by the high winds. The sign is gone already. Now you got wave action. That wave action starts working on infrastructure. That could be buildings, that could be bridges, whatever the case may be. So you can see that now the floodwaters are well up. It's like you're in the ocean now, because the ocean is on the land. And with that ocean action, there goes somebody's business and what you actually do see. So a storm surge is a gradual rise, but when it comes up, it stays for a long period of time and it moves inland. And with this kind of amount of water and wave action, tremendous amount of infrastructure damage can be actually done. So I wanted to show this video so that you understand that sea level rise, the storm surge is a gradual. It's not a wall of water comes on at once, like a tsunami. Those are different. This comes in and stays, and now you can see that you're about 8-10 feet storm surge sitting here, and the amount of destruction that can be done with that. So we can also look at heavy rainfall that's occurring, and we define that as roughly about close to 4 inches in 24 hours. That can cause a lot of flooding and a lot of landslides that can occur. You see a lot of this, especially out on the West Coast, but we're starting to see a lot of this now in the Northeast, especially along the Appalachians and so forth. We are seeing that we see these precipitation events that are actually increasing. Rainfall trends, as you see, they go up and down, but overall, there is an increase in these extreme rainfalls that we are seeing. The results of all these are these catastrophic floods that you will see. They occur around the world, and in some areas where you don't even expect them. Upper left is Africa. Over to the west, what is that? That's in England. That's near the Thames River. Then you look in the bottom left, where is that? Furnace Creek, California, which actually has the world's highest recorded temperature of 127. That's the desert. That's Death Valley. And yet they managed to get 3 inches of rain within 24 hours in the amount of flooding. And this more recently in Dubai, where they had tremendous amount of flooding and rain from the rain. And you can see the kind of infrastructure problems that you're having. So again, we're starting to see this trend going up of these 3-inch rainfall events. On the left-hand side, what I wanted to show you is 58 to 2012. There was like a 38% increase in the precipitation of extreme events. Now we find from 1958 to 2012, we look at that data, and we're seeing in the Northeast, we're getting 71% increase. So what does this mean? The Northeast is going to start flooding more. The Southwest is probably going to still continue to be dry. On the right, what I'm showing you are the daily record lows and highs that have been set since 1930. You're starting to see an increase in the record highs that are occurring. So we got a kind of double-edged sword here. We're getting warming, we're getting flooding, but we're getting things shifted, where it's not uniformly spread, it's concentrated in different regions of the world, or even within a particular country and so forth. So here at the Climate Center, this is our history record of droughts. Would it be moderate, severe, or extreme droughts? You can see that we are going down here in the Northeast, less and less in terms of the vertical is the entire area. The little icon on the upper left is where the data comes from. So West Virginia, Maryland, up to Maine. So the area is decreasing, the frequency is decreasing, and now we have a new system that we're putting together to try and get this really narrowed down to regions rather than by counties. So we do have this drought monitoring that is an experiment. We've been experimenting this for a year. We're trying to make this go probably by the end of this year to make it available for people to look at. So you can see specifically now within New York State, where is the drought going? To do this, we had to set up more monitors to be able to do that. What we do find is I would tell everybody to stay here in the Northeast because our droughts are becoming less frequent. And when they do happen, they don't last very long. Unfortunately, if they hit at the wrong period, like late July, early August, that will affect the corn crop. So again, we have to be very careful. We have a good side, but we have to also worry about when they actually occur. And in terms of temperature changes, this one here is showing that we are going up, and we actually exceeded the 2.0 in November of 2003. We passed the global average temperature of that. That seems to be the point we don't want to go. We want to stay between the 1.5 and the 2. That's not happening. I don't care what any protocol says or anything like that. All that stuff you see in there's plotted by year, and all you're seeing is that we're just exceeding year by year. And so far for 2024, we're not doing very good. So all the way up through the end of March, you can see that we are hot already. We're setting a record pace, breaking 2023 already in the first 3 months of the global temperatures. So the upshot of all this that I wanted to say to you was fire, water, and heat. These are things that we are concerned about because they can be localized they can be in regional areas or global, but global and regional can still affect localized area. So my concern that I would have right now is that our health and our infrastructure are under attack. And we better start doing something pretty fast about it, either both in terms of trying to stop it or slow it down, but also a better way of reacting to these type of events. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Professor. That was outstanding. Wow. More than a little concerning. Aaron, go ahead and share your screen. Mark, unshare yours.
Okay.
And I will introduce Mr. Mair. Aaron Mair is the Adirondack Wilderness Campaign Director. He is a board member and former president of the Sierra Club, a member of the Environmental Justice Advisory Group, New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, former Albany Pinebush Preserve Commissioner, former Spatial Analyst and Program Research Specialist with the New York State Department of Health. Aaron will speak on biodiversity, the Adirondacks, and environmental justice. Take it away.
Well, thank you. Can we hear me? Thumbs up?
Yes, very good.
Okay, thank you. Well, first and foremost, it is indeed an honor to be here. And again, I want to thank Mark for his wonderful presentation. You know, that is the heavy science behind a lot of the work. And we are at a stage, and what my talk in part is not only to talk about the biodiversity side, but really the urgent call to action. You're probably seeing the image of the frog in the pot that the slow boiled, and the frog doesn't hop out because it's just a slow rise. And that's where we are. And as Mark was pointing out, this is really basic math, basic physics and science. And I'm glad that he lifted up that point on the slide about that last year we went above the 2 degrees Celsius mark, but yet we've also had a 1 year which we were at or above the 1.5 degree Celsius global temperature average, and which is a huge big deal. No matter what you take away from this, the physics of 2 degrees Celsius is this. It's the cryosphere. The cryosphere is at altitude where you see snow caps. It's the temperature at the polar regions, Arctica and Antarctic, with regards to glaciers. Once we hit that 2 degrees Celsius threshold, things just melt. And that's just the physics of ice. You no longer have temperature at altitude or at surface that can, as I say, sustain the freezing temp. So we start to lose things like winter. We just had an event here in the Adirondacks called Saving Winter, which again, alerting folks to the rising temperatures, but its immediate impacts on weather patterns. So first and foremost, again, let me say it's an honor to be here addressing all of you, especially those within the legal profession, because you right now are a critical cohort in the fight or the call to action. You are, as a former attorney once said, the folks who define what is. And it's a profession that is perhaps one of the most consequential in the age of anthropogenic climate change. Granted, a lot of our elected representatives are not lawyers, but many of them rely upon the legal profession for expertise. And it's a profession that has a profound impact. Some of you may have saw me debating with a pretty famous attorney senator over whether or not the earth is warming or cooling. And that senator then was just a good example of the Carl Sandburg thesis of, if you don't have the facts, argue the law. If you don't have the law, argue the facts. And if you don't have both on your side, you pound the table. And near the close of his point, because again, talking about the science and the impacts of climate change in the Senate hearing, it's right for those within this profession to find, as I say, when you argue the law, the reasonable doubt, because science is not going to say 100% certain, because there's always those weird anomalies in the data. But the scientific method over time, one of the biggest things about science are the trends. What are the trends saying? And right now, as Mark laid out, the trends are moving us in a strong direction of very, very, very serious consequence. And so scholars like Professor Mann have argued that we should not over accentuate the pending disasters, or as they say, they come up with a term climate doomerism, that we still have to point out that there's hope and there's opportunity. Yes, there is, but that is also leading us to what my concern is the proverbial frog in the boiling water that will eventually be boiled to death. And that's why I travel the country and the state urging action on climate. And one of the pieces that I come from, I'm a retired public health professional, a retired epidemiologist, 36 years with the New York State Department of Health. And one of the things I look at is patterns and trends and intersectionality and how things are connected when we talk about from a science end, but also from my rich history in civil rights and founding what is now the environmental justice movement. We look at how laws and how they are connected. Now they can actually have an impact, not an impact on one segment of society, but can, as I say, have an impact on all of us. But I also look at the fact that we cannot write off any one segment. And I'm drawn to two of my heroes. One is John Mair and one is Dr. King. And both of them, through the parallel syllogism, arrive at the critical point that we cannot, as I say, ignore any aspect of our environment, our climate, our civil society, and how we are all connected to this planet, and how the impacts of one set of actors and one set of our civil society or the corporate society impacts us all. And this is a robust example and lesson also in that how through the laws and through common action, we can come together and also pulling on that thread bring about great change. I am the current wilderness campaign director. I retired from the State Department of Health, so I could take this particular profession primarily because this is the place, not going out on the public health circuit, that needs the attention. I've taken this job in the Adirondacks. Adirondacks, at over 6 million acres, is the largest wilderness carbon sink in the lower 48 states. So as any serious activist or scientist of any background, you want to push and advance those solutions. You heard about geothermal, you heard about wind, possibly hydro, and some of the other clean energy solutions that Dr. Williams lifted up. But another natural solution that's been around since the planet is the wilderness, and the biggest carbon sink is both the ocean, and the second largest carbon sink is, as I say, our soils, our forests, and our trees. And so taking and moving the fight to protecting wilderness as part of President Biden's 30 by 30, but also part of the New York CLCPA efforts to, as I say, reverse the impacts of climate change, being in the Adirondacks and lifting up the Adirondacks and fighting for the expansion and protection of wilderness and biodiversity as a critical climate solution is one of our frontline areas that we all must engage in. I mentioned, again, that frog, but the issue is, why should we care, is that this is something that we need to act on now. And the biggest issue is that though many of us are situationally aware of the impacts of climate and climate change, many of us are not taking the direct assertive action that we need to deal with. And the biggest issue right now is the slow pace of action. The slow pace, and this is again that frog's just simmering in the pot. The slow pace of not realizing the urgency of what a 2 degrees Celsius, which literally is between now and 2050. So some folks say it may be later, and some folks say that may happen earlier. Will humanity end? The answer is no. It's not doomerism. Our species will adapt. The question is that the conflicts, and as you heard, some of the insurance costs of right now, the current climate disasters that we're experiencing, we're just getting a small dose of what the impacts financially, as well as personally and physically on our environment, our civil societies, and our community is happening. The issue right now is how are we engaging the solutions, and I've been involved in direct action from attending COPs for the past 20 years and to the most recent COP. And I've been speaking at these COPs on the protection of our wilderness assets. And, shielding them, as I said, from some of the short-sighted actions that actually deplete and depreciate them in ways that many folks see as a carbon. In fact, one of the things that they have as part of the climate strategy is something called biomass. And what biomass allows them to do is cut down trees and forests and make wood pellets and suggest that that is a carbon neutral activity. But the fact of the matter is our old growth, because there's the corporate industry standard saying, oh, you can cut down the older trees because they don't sequester much carbon as younger trees, which again, the science does not support that. But like tobacco pushing its arguments about cigarettes, or the fossil fuel sector right now talking about carbon capture storage or carbon sequestration storage technology that allows them to drill more fossil fuels. The argument that logging and cutting down old growth forests and that the efforts will actually allow for younger trees and therefore more carbon sequestration actually is not a proven scientific argument. There's a lot of great scientists like Dr. Chad Hansen of the Wilderness Action Network in the West Coast, as well as a number of other scientists that deal with the old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest, that tend to suggest that the older trees are actually, because of their root system and their root networks, actually sequester more, if not significant amounts of carbon, and the need to protect them is very, very critical. And it's one of the reasons why I have been working with not only intergenerationally, but with even land stewards to protect not only the forest, but the soils, because the soils are a critical part. And the critical part of the soils are all the flora and fauna and wildlife that also live in harmony with the whole ecology. That is what drives the power of carbon sequestration, not only within our forest, but also within the soils, and the need to take urgent action to lift that up. It is the most critically and defining thing that we can do at this moment. New York State, with its massive asset in wilderness protection, the need to scale that up. And right now, folks feel that it's not as urgent, and some folks feel that it is. I'm obviously biased to the fact that this is where we need to be, especially when we're facing down the barrel of a 2 degrees Celsius intake and the need to have and protect as much old growth forest. Mark didn't point out one of the things about the Northeast within the United States. That is the Goldilocks zone. As things get really, really, really bad in climate, that Goldilocks zone from Maine all the way down to northern Pennsylvania is going to be one of the areas of critical, as I say, climate sequestration significance, but also you're going to see a lot of demand on that land. So the very forest that I'm fighting for right now will see a lot of pressure as the very wealthy, like with Hurricane Katrina, they were the first to flee, as the wealthy move up north and east to start to buy up lands, and then, as they say, make them look like the suburban sprawl areas where they currently live. So the despoiling and the destruction of more forests as people move to a Goldilocks zone, as they say, and try to ride out the climate emergency for their generation. And the fact of the matter is, while that short-term thinking and having the means to do so may be an action that many of the wealthy would follow, the reality is, without protection of these areas in this critical asset, would lead to the hastening and the worsening, because again, you're losing a critical frontline asset. And by the way, carbon sequestration by forest is not something that we can readily adapt and build a man-made equivalent. So the issue is about sweating the small stuff and sweating, as they say, the details, and pulling people together to protect this wilderness and the wilderness ecosystems. And this is one of the critical ethos that I engage in with regards to, as I say, taking action now. And as Mark Williams pointed out, this is just from 2023 impacts, those very storms, what it looked like locally on the Adirondacks. So no area is safe, even the Adirondacks with its wilderness. You can see not only massive ecological damage, but the storms are what they call atmospheric rivers, which not only deliver 2 or 3 years worth of rain in one event, but the destruction to infrastructure is catastrophic and significant. And two issues that at the federal level of climate deniers, as I say, within our legislative policymakers, by not funding and investing or delaying action in this space, in which some elected leaders are pejoratively calling the green scam, The green scam is not a scam. Again, there are just facts and data. The question is, where do you look for these facts and data? Actuarially, all you got to look is at the insurance binders of insurance sector and areas that they've already mapped out that are going to be under severe threat or severe financial risk for them to invest in or to assure or give insurance for those areas. So we're seeing that already within coastal regions, but they've also got floodplain maps that states basically maintain going back, let's say the 500-year to 700-year 200-year floodplain. So areas that used to be on old historic maps, old rivers that may have, again, you would have to have a significant weather event to see the impact of what these things are. But right now, these are becoming routine, semi-annual events. And so no longer are they all 5 or 200 years. They're coming season to season. And this is what happened in the Adirondacks. Again, old historical watersheds or old watersheds that are now, as I say, with the event of a 5 or 6 or 7-inch rain, now flooding and taking back and reclaiming the old riverbeds, ancient riverbeds, and thereby creating significant property destruction. Again, Dr. Williams pointed out the impacts with regards to the evolution in some of the charts, but this is what a destabilized climate looks like. So when they talk about climate change, not only is there global warming, but the impacts on ocean currents, air currents, as we destabilize the polar vortex, and which is going to drive a lot of these severe atmospheric events and atmospheric impacts. And so when we look at just, again, the past year of maps of increased intensity and increased damage, increased loss. And again, this is measured in human lives, forest, land, impacts that are just dramatic, not only in just observed in just the data, but absolutely the billions of dollars and trillions of dollars in actual cost. And the impacts of the destabilized polar vortex is the absolute climate disruption. So climate change is not only the issue of over time global warming, but those disruptions in the idiosyncratic impacts that they will have not only upon our land and our forests and our communities, but clearly the physics again of the ice sheets and the cryosphere that is dependent upon a stabilized climate that we're looking at. We're now witnessing, again, some of the extreme weather events that are, as I say, that are now becoming commonplace and that are capturing a lot of attention. And again, it's not a rapid onset, like I talked about that boiling frog. It is a slow onset. But the fact is that there's no reversing of this trend. We're not going back. This will be the new normal, and the new normal will be chronically changing, and not for the better, but for the worse. And so this new normal will create a lot of the things that we say the proverbial climate refugees. A lot of the global conflicts that we're going to see as the fight for water resources. We're going to see, couched in all other geopolitical terms, but these are really climate-fueled disasters that are manifesting themselves in the form of human migration that we may say is a border crisis. But again, these are also part and symptomatic of the climate crisis that we're facing. Again, I love this report that I've pulled from the IPCC report. And again, you see here the trends that have the projected, assuming that we had the lower blue line of the 1.5 degrees Celsius from Paris. You have the limited warming at 2 degrees Celsius. But the one that you need to pay attention to is where the trend that we are on right now. And that is something that is disconcerting. And it's one of the crises that drive me more so to direct action and organizing than anything else. And this is another report that I pulled from the 2023 IPCC report. And to me, as an epidemiologist, as a former health professional, when you start to look at the impact of the crisis in, as they say, what generations will bear the burdens and what generations will bear the impacts as we start to head toward a very unsustainable levels of, as I say, climate growth. And at a certain point, our species is in a crisis. So this is not an issue of doomerism or alarmism. This is an issue of potential futures that can unfold depending upon what action that we take right now. Again, even if we take all the best action right now, we're still going to witness some of the impacts of global warming because, again, we have already locked in through the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. It's already triggering a chain of events. And not too many people realize that water is also a greenhouse gas, but it is a more of a dependent variable upon all the other greenhouse gases heating up the planet and evaporating more water. As we start to sequester and hold that more water and that more heat, it becomes that much more a threat to our species and the work that we need to do as people with regards to taking serious action. So right now, for me, the issue is how do we mobilize? And this is, I love these infographics. One of the things as a public health professional, you'll never get tired of infographics, but also for lawyers and attorneys. So what does a 1.5 degrees Celsius look like, a world look like? What does a 2 degrees Celsius world look like? What does a 3 degree down to the species extincting 3 and 4 degrees Celsius? It is the ability and the carrying to, as I said, for the land or the planet to have the carrying capacity to sustain life as we know it. We are that rare species. This is why it's anthropogenic climate change, that we will actually have a power and a choice of whether or not we will go extinct. This is not something that we can put off to tomorrow, that if we take action tomorrow, that everything will be okay. And this is where it becomes quite deceptive. We feel that there's somebody in government or somebody within our elected leaders, if the crisis hits, that they will take action and we will be safe. Let me be clear, the crisis has already been hitting. And even if we take some of the best action right now, we're looking at trying to stay between that 1.5 and 2 degrees the Celsius world. But if you remember that little red track line, we're heading on our way to a 3 degrees Celsius world. And again, this is not to as I say, to say it's doomerous. The answer, the fact and the physics of temperature, that is a reality. The question is, what are we doing and how aggressive do we become, as they say, to adapt our nations, to adapt our policies, to take action? And this is where you see in some countries, lawyers filing innovative lawsuits against their governments for failing to take action. But that's where we are right now. We've got a lot of bad attorneys. The attorney that I battled with in Congress, Senator Ted Cruz, he went from arguing facts, law, when those things weren't lining up. He basically pounded the table and demanded that I apologize because the world is actually cooling. The reality is that when climate change actually impacted Houston, Mr. Cruz hopped on a plane and went to Cancun. And none of us have that, not all of us have that material luxury. The poor, the working class, folks who don't understand the complexities of the science behind global warming are easily lulled into inaction. And right now we need all of those in the professions, as I say, in legislature, in this legal profession to help shape those policies that would engage and push people toward action. I've been working alongside numerous leaders to fight the fossil fuel sector. The fossil fuel sector had its largest representation at COP, this last COP, the Council of Parties, UN Council of Parties, in Dubai, a fossil fuel state. And it's not an accident our last two COPs, COP 27 and COP 28, were held in failed and non-democracies. And one being a petrol state. And that petrol state COP had the largest amount of, in fact, I think that you had more fossil fuel representatives there than grassroots NGOs. And that's a bad sign. But that said, it is the vehicle by which at a global level we can take action and make change, but more importantly, push these states and show fearless, direct action that just because it's held here is not another vehicle for you to maintain your stranded assets in fossil fuels. So having a fossil fuel prince or kingdom downplay some of the steps in the urgency that we need to do, and then try to suggest that man-made technologies like carbon capture storage are going to be the silver bullets that allow for them, to continue to drill for oil and engage in the sale of fossil fuels. Remember, United States is absolutely troubling and quadrupling its green assets and its response. But at the same time, we've also increased the production and subsidy of fossil fuels. We must see a full 180 shift in that and totally divest from fossil fuels. One of the things that left every morning I woke up in Dubai was seeing a haze. And let me be clear, it was since the Clean Air Act, I've never seen a haze like this. And I grew up in New York City, and I used to spend my summers down in New York City as a kid during the 60s. And I remember those hazy days. But to go over in that fossil fuel state, this is what we woke up to every day. At the same time, the irony was lost upon that state and its arguments in trying to prop up fossil fuels by feeling that we can give a little bit of A to green energy and green commitments, but while at the same time, assuring that we can still preserve and burn fossil fuels. And it's a very, very powerful signal that you're sending to the global community that you're not really serious about climate action. And one of the other things of note from COP28 was the lack of presidential leadership. The fact that President Biden didn't go to this, even though he got us back into COP. Remember, United States, which was a climate leader under the last administration, pulled out of the Council of Parties. And so we more so, hopefully, with this current noise that we're dealing with right now, hopefully after this election cycle, if there is a victory of Democrats, that we will really seriously triple and quadruple our efforts with regards to, as I say, engagement of COP, but also reminder of who has the most at stake. As Dr. Williams pointed out, the frontline communities, many of them within coastal areas, many of them in the global south, are bearing disproportionately the brunt of climate impacts. Even though in Paris they pledged $100 billion of a fund for developing nations, to date, and that was $100 billion a year. To date, out of all the years since 2015, you're lucky if there's $60 billion in that fund right now. And even that is being driven by more like loans and investments rather than offset. Again, these frontline communities do face the front end burden. But the other critical loss and danger that, again, signaling how bad we are, and again, how that water is boiling. This was the COP that was supposed to be dealing with fossil fuel drawdowns. And we're actually walked away, and this COP closed without a commitment to draw down or a pledge to draw down or reduce or end the production, or as I say, of fossil fuels. So this is a really, really serious big blow. And this is why when you look at that graph that we're on a fast track to the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, this COP is indicative of that. I'm going to close here because I'm well over my 20 minutes of talk. But the other impact I wanted to point out was that while this was the largest representation of the fossil fuel sector at a Council of Parties summit, this was also one of the most restrictive, most repressive for NGO organizations. They were absolutely compartmentalized, and they had the least amount of space. And these are the frontline communities bearing the most impact. But still, that said, the ability to show up and make the voices known and speak, as they say, to the threats and risk. I've had a few opportunities to get on global media with regards to our civil society's last gasp, but more importantly, the need to continue support for direct action, but also being the resilient frontline communities that are right now being the most aggressive voices. Again, it's kind of weird to see frontline communities of colors really being very powerful voices at these movements. But at the same time, the global north and the global majority and corporate America and global corporations are taking and doing everything, as I say, in their power to, as I say, to maintain or minimize the aggressive action that's needed. Right now, we need aggressive, bold action to stave off the worsening effects. And like I said, I took direct personal action, not only through all the things I do from solar to geothermal, but right now, even being that frontline voice, advocating for wilderness carbon sinks and pushing for communities to engage full bore in the actions. Right now, it was actually part of a treaty signing by the Mohawk Nation, a nation that battled against an entity called Hydro-Quebec in Canada, to now where they were brought on as equity partners in something called the Champlain-Hudson Power Express. For the first time, they are corporate partners supplying green energy to the state of New York to offset the burning of nuclear and natural gas in the Hudson River Valley, but delivering over 20% of clean energy to New York City. Again, models that are coming forward, led by frontline communities, but also frontline communities in collaboration with governments to really try to shift the needles. And that is the bold action that we need right now. But a critical piece of that action are people within the legal profession to go from, just arguing the facts of the law. The facts are here. We need more laws here. But what we definitely need to reduce are those who have no facts all on their side, continually pounding the table with the false climate solutions, but more importantly, solutions of inaction and for solutions of drill, baby, drill, even though it may be profitable for them in their careers in the short term. It's definitely the destruction in the head of humanity as we know it in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron Mair. I share your passion and concern. All right, I think what we're going to do now is go right on with Michael Gerard. So Aaron, unshare your screen, and Michael, share yours. And I will introduce Professor Gerard.
Can you see my screen?
Let's see. I can. And I'm calling up my notes here. Michael Gerard is the Andrew Sabin Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia Law School, where he teaches courses on environmental and energy law and founded and directs the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. He is the former chair of the faculty of Columbia's Earth Institute and currently holds a joint appointment to the Columbia Climate School. Before joining the Columbia faculty in 2009, he practiced environmental law in New York City full-time from 1979 to 2008. He formerly chaired the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. Gerard is author and editor of 14 books. The most recent are Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States and Global Climate Change and U.S. Law. Professor Gerard will speak with us about domestic developments relating to decarbonization. Take it away, Professor.
Thank you very much, Carl. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually. So the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015 required each country to submit a nationally determined contribution, an NDC, which basically its pledge for what it was going to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In Paris, President Obama pledged a 17% reduction in U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 and a 26 to 28% reduction by 2025. President Biden extended the U.S. pledge to a reduction of 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. So that's the U.S. NDC. Another document that is somewhat less official extends the pledge out to 2050 and calls for net zero by 2050, which is where we need to be if we're going to meet the Paris temperature targets. So on the day that he was inaugurated, President Biden signed a stack of executive orders, including a couple on climate change and rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. But he understood that he couldn't go far enough by just executive action alone. He needed Congress. So he tried to push forward legislation that would put a great deal of money available for the energy transition and would also impose what would essentially be a carbon tax on the electric power industry. There were tough negotiations that followed, especially with Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. But finally, Congress did pass the Inflation Reduction Act. Here is President Biden signing it and giving the pen to Senator Manchin, who looks happier than President Biden in this picture. But in any event, the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law, and it does not have the carbon tax on power companies, although it does have a fee on methane. But the Inflation Reduction Act does make an enormous amount of money available for clean energy. And Carl, I just want to make sure that you're seeing me move the slides. Or am I still on the first slide?
You're good, Mike.
Okay, good. So the Inflation Reduction Act on the right, you see the business tax credits that are provided by the statute. And most of the money is tax credits for business, and also on the left we see individual tax credits. And then there are also some other grant and loan programs. One of the major efforts now is to try to spend the money that goes in grants and loans before the election, because nobody knows how the election is going to turn out. The tax credits, both the business and the individual tax credits, are written into the Internal Revenue Code. They were enacted by Congress. It would take Congress to take them away. Some of the Republicans are calling for that. I have some doubt they'll be able to succeed, even if the Republicans take over the House and the Senate and the White House after the November election. They tried to do that with the Affordable Care Act unsuccessfully. A lot of this money is going to red states, and so it's not clear that they would be able to get the votes. So on the right, you can see where the money is coming from. On the left, you see where the money is going. And most of the money is going to energy supply, which is mostly wind and solar, as well as storage, some for nuclear, some for carbon capture and sequestration and other uses. And then you see that there are a number of other uses that where the money is going. So how far does this get us? This chart on the left, you see what actual U.S. greenhouse gas emissions have been. Then you see the line that's business as usual, what the emissions would be out to 2030 if there were no Inflation Reduction Act. You see where the Inflation Reduction Act, if fully implemented, would take us, and what the Paris target is, what the U.S. NDC would be. So the Inflation Reduction Act takes us much of the way there, but not all of the way there. So the Biden administration has been doing a lot of other things to try to advance the environmental causes, including climate change. The Washington Post tracks all these actions, and you could see that there have been 93 policies that have been adopted and 73 proposed. It's also been necessary to overturn a lot of the policies that were adopted during the Trump administration, because those were going in the other direction. And so of all the policies that are included in this accounting, you see that the largest number concern air pollution and greenhouse gases, also quite a few on drilling and extraction, which is obviously also directly related to greenhouse gases, and then various other aspects of environmental protection. The Biden administration has also been working not only through executive orders, which can be readily revoked, but to adopt regulations that go through the full Administrative Procedure Act process. And already in final form are regulations with emission standards for new passenger vehicles out to model year 2026, brand new emission standards for heavy trucks, approval of the California waiver, which means that California can adopt even stronger motor vehicle emission standards than are nationwide. And when California does that, usually about 14 other states sign on, so it's very significant. New regulations from the Securities and Exchange Commission on climate disclosure by companies, standards for methane emissions from oil and gas, restoring the Clean Air Act cost-benefit standards, and new regulations on climate preparedness for industrial facilities. There are also some regulations that were sort of broken into phases, and some of them have been done, some of them are still pending. This includes regulations under the National Environmental Policy Act, including those relevant to climate change, energy efficiency standards for appliances, phase down of hydrofluorocarbons, which are powerful greenhouse gases. There are also some regulations that have been issued in proposed form and are going to be issued soon, for the most part, in final form. They have to be issued soon because if we wait too long, and if the Republicans take over the Congress and the White House, they can revoke the regulations under the Congressional Review Act. And so the Biden administration is working to have these regulations go final very soon. So that would be emission standards for new vehicles from 2027 and beyond, emission standards for new and existing fossil fuel power plants to replace the Clean Power Plan that was stopped by the courts. These standards are actually expected this week, updating various rules on flood insurance and climate disclosures for federal contractors that in some ways go beyond what the SEC rules are. I should point out that just about all the regulations are then challenged in court once they go final, mostly by the red states and various industry groups. So that doesn't automatically mean that they're not in effect, but they're facing litigation. So the principal task we have, as everybody knows, is moving away from fossil fuels. We need to get to an economy that is relying as much as possible on renewable energy. But so far, only 13% of the primary energy consumption in the US comes from renewable energy. We are making progress. Coal has greatly declined as a source of energy for the power sector. Renewables have gone up, and now the renewables, this is wind and solar and hydro for the most part, produce more electricity in the US than coal, but natural gas continues to rise. So the rise of natural gas is a major challenge. But we are seeing a tremendous growth in the US in renewable power capacity. As you can see, hydro is about flat, but wind has been going up and solar has been going up even more. So this is a good trend. And this year, it's expected that almost all of the new capacity of power generation going into the grid will be carbon-free, mostly solar, but also a lot of battery storage, which we need for intermittent sources like wind and solar, and some gas, or one new nuclear plant just opened, but it's mostly clean energy. And one reason we've seen these trends is that the cost of these energy sources, of the clean energy sources, has plummeted. This reflects the levelized cost. It's the operating cost, which is mostly the fuel, which obviously is free for wind and solar, and the amortized capital cost. So it's the levelized cost of energy is all in, and we see the yellow and orange lines are a couple of different kinds of solar. And just in the last 5 years, since 2009, we see the cost of those has just plummeted. Wind has, in the blue, has gotten much cheaper, whereas the fossil sources have not gotten cheaper. So when we look at the situation today, Lazard, the investment banking firm, periodically puts out these charts showing the levelized costs of different sources of energy. And we see that solar PV, utility scale, and onshore wind here are around cost about the same as gas combined cycle, which is the cheapest form of fossil generation today. And this is without subsidies. When we add in the tax subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act, the economic advantage of wind and solar becomes even clearer. So in this chart, the black lines are the unsubsidized costs. The gray lines are the subsidized costs, and the crosshatch are an additional tax subsidy available to these sources if they have enough domestic content. Now, there are trade issues about whether the domestic content restrictions are permissible under the WTO, but they're currently in the law. Meanwhile, the U.S. has been increasing our natural gas production and export. This has a lot of geopolitical implications, which Amy Myers-Jaffe will mention after I'm done. And the U.S. has become the top producer of crude oil in the world. We used to be way behind, but we have soared past Saudi Arabia and Russia. This is almost entirely as a result of fracking. And that happened both under the Obama administration and the Trump administration. If Trump wins the November election, the best predictor of what he might do is probably this report from the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative organization that issued this major report on what they propose would happen in a second Trump administration. And it includes seeking a repeal of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. As I said, I'm not sure that'll happen. They explicitly say they want to have a lot of political appointees ready on day one and put them in charge of many EPA offices. They want to stay and the implementation of and reconsider many existing regulations, withdraw the U.S. from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which Trump didn't do, and withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement, which Trump did, and Biden has now put his back. They want to end the California waiver for greenhouse gases so that we have fewer clean cars, shrink the staff of EPA, shift a lot of decisions from the federal government to the state, eliminate the Office of Environmental Justice, quote, oppose eyesore windmills built at taxpayer expense, close quote, and lots else. The final thing I want to say, and let me just say, so on the day that Trump was inaugurated in 2017, he signed executive orders taking away a lot of the Obama action, and if he comes back, he'll sign executive orders taking away a lot of the Biden action, just as Biden took away a lot of the Trump action. So we go back and forth on this. Finally, there's a lot of litigation going on in the U.S. There are 25 lawsuits brought mostly by states and cities against fossil fuel companies seeking money damages so that they can adapt to climate change. There has been a fight for the last 7 years about whether they belong in federal court or state court. The plaintiffs want to be in state court. The defendant fossil fuel companies want to be in federal court. They're now pretty much in state court. But in one of the cases that has gotten the furthest, a case brought by Honolulu against several fossil fuel companies, upheld by the state Supreme Court, the defendants are trying to get in front of the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court. If the U.S. Supreme Court grants review, that may put a halt to these cases until the Supreme Court acts. Otherwise, we may start to see some trials in these cases. As I indicated, just about everything that the Biden administration is doing on climate change gets challenged in court. So there are a lot of these cases that are now pending. There's also an important case that has been argued, and we're now awaiting a decision, Loper Bright versus Raimondo, in which there's an effort to repeal the Chevron doctrine, the legal doctrine under which the interpretation of ambiguous federal statutes is largely left to the agencies rather than the courts. If as expected, the Chevron doctrine is repealed or weakened, that would in turn weaken EPA. There are a lot of challenges to fossil fuel projects, particularly natural gas pipelines. On the other hand, there are challenges to wind and solar projects. Obviously, we need a lot of wind and solar projects, and these challenges go in the wrong direction. There was a trial over the summer in a case in Montana called Held versus Montana, in which the court ruled for the youth plaintiffs, saying that a pro-fossil fuel policy of the state of Montana violated the environmental rights provision of the Montana state constitution. The plaintiffs won that case. It's now under appeal to the Montana Supreme Court. There's a similar case coming up to trial in Hawaii. New York State has a new environmental constitutional provision in our Bill of Rights. We don't yet have a climate case under it, but we probably will at some point. And finally, there's a lot of litigation about greenwash, about the efforts by various companies to falsely portray their environmental actions. So that's my summary of what's happening at the domestic level in the U.S.
Thank you, Michael. Fabulous as always. Thank you, the attendees. Thank you, the bar. Thank you, panelists. Really appreciate your time and expertise. And we'll say thank you and happy Earth Day to attendees, and enjoy the rest of your day. We'll sign off now. Thanks all.